This story is entitled In Pursuit of a Dream, and it provides a personal insight into the selection process that one has to undergo before becoming a paratrooper in the South African Army. It is written and narrated by an ordinary man in the street whose adventure began when he was almost 39 years of age. In Pursuit of a Dream is copyrighted by the author, 2019. Chapter 1. The Prologue. An Ending. Dust. Like fine powder. That is what I remember. The fine powder that was clinging to the inside of my throat and my parched mouth longed for water. Just a sip. Just one tiny sip to wash some of it away. I was grateful that I was no longer sweating. My body had sacrificed every last ounce of fluid, and no longer did I have to deal with the pain of salt burning my bloodshot eyes. It was relatively quiet, and the gentle purring of the ambulance engine was all that I could hear. I was aware of the medics and the instructors who sat on the bonnet of this ambulance, observing me. They never said a word. Not one word was spoken, and yet they knew enough to have a drip on standby as they anticipated my collapse. Shuffling slowly towards the destination, I lifted my head and I could see that I was now alone on the gravel track. The others had successfully completed the task and were sitting quietly, now dark silhouettes against the western sky, watching the drama unfold. Sergeant Major Smith was there, and, of course, Captain Marius du Plessis, the officer commanding the parachute training school. I was 65 meters from where they were gathered, and suddenly there was urgency. An instructor climbed from the bonnet of the ambulance and maintained the same snail pace beside me. His words were simple. "Number 13, he said, if you sprint, you will make it." How I wished that I could increase my pace, but the weight of the past 3 days was too much for me. The ammunition canister that I was carrying was utterly awkward. My arms were up behind my head supporting this bloated metal tube, but I suppose that I looked more like a person whose arms were raised in surrender. The relentless African sun had been merciless, and mustering all the energy that I could find, I looked up. I saw the imposing figure of Captain du Plessis now less than 30 meters in front of me. I noticed, too, that he was observing his stopwatch. As my head began to droop forwards, I saw him repeatedly crossing his arms in front of his waist. It was much like a referee's assistant does when a kick at posts drifts wide. He had signalled the end of his selection course, and in doing so, had brought the curtain down on mine. I pressed on to the end, which was a mere 15 paces, and as I got to where du Plessis was standing, he aggressively shoved his stopwatch into my face. In my despair and confusion, I could not immediately process the information on display. It took a determined effort from me to recognize that 27 seconds beyond the allocated time for that particular event, the final event, had elapsed. After 3 days and 2 nights, I was 27 seconds too late. An instructor whose face I did not see shouted at me. He stood right beside me and shouted. He called me all manner of derogatory things and told me in no uncertain terms that I had failed selection. He graphically announced that I had wasted my efforts over the past 3 days and 2 nights, and that the airborne fraternity held no place for wannabes like me. It seemed as though he was more devastated than I was. I glanced quickly around and met the eyes of Sergeant Major Smith. With one single imperceptible nod of his head, he acknowledged me. The other candidates were silent as they sat in a neat row upon the dirt road. Most showed their quiet support by giving me the thumbs up. I did my best to smile, but my chapped and sunburnt lips would simply not cooperate. Duplessis struck me hard on the shoulder with an open hand before ripping the number band from my overall. When I challenged him with my eyes, he struck me again before banishing me to his pickup truck. I sat alone on the back of his vehicle as the 20 candidates who had successfully completed the selection process ran in a squad back to 44 Parachute Regiment. They were clad only in dirty overalls, singing enthusiastically while clapping in time to keep the rhythm. I sat isolated, lonely, exhausted and utterly dejected, watching as they followed me sitting on the slow-moving vehicle. And so it was that we travelled up past the main parade ground and on towards the parachute training hangar. Chapter 2. The Beginning. For many years I have enjoyed a strong interest in matters relating to the military. Inasmuch as I did embrace my conscription years in the South African Defence Force, I feel that there was even more that I could and should have done. Consequently, when an article appeared in the daily newspaper which invited former South African paratroopers to attend a retraining exercise that was to be held locally, I found my interest being further stimulated. I made contact with the officer commanding this parachute unit and asked him if it were possible for me, as a non-paratrooper, to attend the retraining exercise as a spectator. He was only too happy to oblige. For 3 consecutive days I immersed myself in the event. I watched quietly as the former paratroopers were put through their paces in carrying out, amongst other things, the requisite drills in anticipation of the parachute jump that was soon going to take place. Even though these former soldiers, or veterans as they are colloquially known, were now civilians, some of them even middle-aged, the standard of discipline that they demonstrated was something to behold. I was fortunate enough to be afforded a seat in the C-130 Hercules aircraft from which they were dispatched. It was as this now empty aircraft banked sharply and headed back to base that I had an overwhelming desire to be part of this brotherhood. During further conversations with the officer commanding, and then more particularly with the company sergeant major, I asked if it were possible for me to become a paratrooper. He already knew that because I had served 2 years as a conscript, I was familiar with the South African military environment. The sergeant major said that theoretically, yes, it was possible, but that I would first have to pass the parachute selection course in Bloemfontein before being accepted onto the jump course. A number of armies have a similar selection process. The British Army has their very tough P company, while the Israeli Defence Force have an equally arduous selection process when determining who is suitable to become a paratrooper. He warned me, though, that as a civilian it would be a tough call, especially considering that I was nearly 39 years of age. I must say that I felt great relief when he told me that I could pass selection and that he would support me every step of the way. Fewer than 20% of those who attempt selection actually pass it, and interestingly, the average age of the permanent force members who attempt the course is 23. I was invited to visit the unit in order to officially begin the process. It was here that I was introduced to several other members, many of whom I recognized from the recent exercise. They greeted me in a friendly manner, and when it was explained to them that I wanted to be parachute trained, they absolutely encouraged me to achieve my ambition and to earn my paratrooper's wings. Earn is the operative word here. Unlike me, they already knew that I would have to take myself to the outer limit of both physical and psychological barriers in order to become a fully fledged member of the unit that they guarded with great pride. On that night, as I committed myself to the process, I had no idea of how steep the mountain between my ambition and South African paratrooper wings would be. Precise details of the current selection course were not readily available, which made training for the event very difficult. The company sergeant major was of great assistance in that, after carrying out some research, he presented me with a framework upon which the selection course was based. He ascertained that an initial set of entry requirements had to be fulfilled before one could progress with the course. The selection itself would be a non-stop event over 3 days and 3 nights, but it was the course leader's prerogative to extend or indeed shorten it if he deemed it necessary. While this was going on, several other veterans arrived at the unit with the same objective in mind. They too had aspirations of becoming paratroopers, but after several weeks disappeared off the scene. The tough regime that had to be followed soon became too much, and they simply fell by the wayside. Obviously, the objectives that they had in mind were of a romantic nature. This in itself is not a negative condition, for I am a great believer in visualizing an outcome before actually achieving it in reality. It is just that when they were called upon to put their thoughts into action, they were found wanting. There was, however, one other person committed to the process. An enthusiastic veteran who introduced himself as Mags had the same ambition as me. In conversation with him, I learnt that he had literally dreamt of being a paratrooper, and quite unexpectedly this opportunity had arisen for him to pursue that dream. At 28 years of age and a professional lifeguard, Mags was the ideal candidate for the course. We soon began to forge a wonderful friendship as we set about establishing a training routine around our jobs and day-to-day lives. Even though Mags and I were not always able to train together, we were in constant contact with one another as we encouraged each other to remain focused. We shared training ideas while discussing what we felt needed to be done in order to prepare ourselves for the selection program. Looking back, I realized that he was a tower of strength. We had been advised that the ability to walk strongly with very heavy packs was of paramount importance. Meeting very early and long before the break of dawn, we would set off into the dark in order to prepare our bodies and our minds. A 13-mile walk with a 66-pound pack became a weekly occurrence. During this time of trudging together, we spoke very little. Like prize fighters, our minds were focused on why we were training and what our preparation was leading to. The entrance requirements, we discovered, consisted of 8 tests relating to speed and strength. I am not going to outline details of them except to say that they were carried out under the close scrutiny of the airborne instructors. These instructors were incredibly strict and uncompromising. One had to complete the entrance tests precisely as they needed to be done. There were no second chances. Even though the pace at which the events took place was unbelievably fast, I was nevertheless amazed to see so many hopefuls failing this part of the course. Indeed, almost 30% of the candidates were removed from the process at this early and introductory stage. The D Company veterans of 3 Parachute Battalion met socially every Monday night at their headquarters in Durban. Here they enjoyed a quiet beer together while watching their supper grill over the glowing coals of a barbecue. It was on these Monday nights that Mags and I conducted the entrance exercises together. One particular person, who shall remain anonymous, was of tremendous support to us. Every Monday night he would give of his time to evaluate our progress. He guided and encouraged us to such an extent that by the time we departed for selection, he felt that we both had a very good chance of success. He constantly reminded us that the selection would take place at a significantly higher altitude than where we were doing our training. This meant that we had to be fitter than ever to ensure a safe passage to the end of the 72 hours. Mags and I were the only two civilians of the 179 candidates drawn from permanent force units across the country who had applied to do the selection course of October that year. Together we travelled to the Parachute Regiment headquarters in Bloemfontein 2 days before the selection was due to begin. On the night before the selection started, we were all summoned and ordered to empty our kit in a large hangar. It was here that the instructors inspected our kit to ensure that no stimulants, food, medicine, or energy drinks were hidden in our equipment. Once each piece had been carefully scrutinized and locked away, we were instructed to return to our sleeping quarters. The overalls that we were going to be wearing for the selection were also isolated, and from the time that we arrived in our bungalows, no candidate was allowed to leave the premises. At 0430 the following morning, we were taken to breakfast before returning to the hangar. We were ordered to remove the overalls that we were wearing and to place them on the floor in front of us. From our positions, we walked across the hangar to dress in our selection overalls and to gather our equipment. It was a very daunting routine which made me realize just how seriously the regiment took this process. We were then told that we were not allowed to consume anything, not even water. I must say that water was not withheld from us. It was just that we were only allowed to drink water when given permission to do so. Chapter 3, Day 1. I have previously mentioned that the pace of the entrance exercises was very fast. I found the experience very daunting, even disorientating. The shouting of the instructors and the shrill piercing of their whistles kept me on edge, but I managed to focus my mind on the tasks that I had been set to do. The entrance requirements were precisely as our Sergeant Major had researched them to be, and as such, nothing caught me by surprise. I found the exercise, which was a 175-meter timed dash known as Fireman's Carry, very difficult. While waiting my turn, I noticed that some partners were abysmal in their efforts. Many dropped their rifles, while others, through a lack of cooperation, simply fell off the shoulders of the carrier. I was, however, very lucky to have been paired to carry a soldier who confidently held both rifles and assisted by balancing himself in an orderly fashion. This young man insisted that I carry first. Looking back, I realized that he did this as a favor to me, because being carried is as equally exhausting as doing the carrying. This meant that I did not have to attempt the dash, having just challenged my physical resources in conveying him over the 175 difficult meters. To this day, I appreciate his kindness and self-sacrifice. These initial tests, while referred to as entrance requirements, are actually part of the selection cycle itself. An enormous part of the group were not successful with this section of the process. By the time that Mags and I were sitting on a truck being transported to the training area in the bush, only 108 candidates remained. The truck stopped after half an hour's drive, and we were ordered off the vehicles and into a line. We then had to present our backpacks for them to be weighed. This was to ensure that they were in excess of 65 pounds. No one was allowed to see the actual weight of their own pack, but I knew that mine would not be rejected by the instructors. I had packed it carefully to ensure that it was exactly 30 kilograms. Those candidates whose equipment was below the minimum weight were ordered to gather rocks from the surrounding area. Under careful scrutiny of the instructors, they then had to add these rocks to their equipment in order to make up the deficit. Not knowing what the deficit was meant that their equipment would then be well over the 30-kilogram minimum weight. This was their punishment for not being adequately prepared for the event. When the instructors were satisfied that our kit was as it should be, we were randomly issued with numbered shoulder bands. I found it very interesting to have received number 39, my age. The course leader then informed us that the numbered shoulder band was an indication that one was still part of the selection process. When removed, this meant that your participation had come to an end. We were then instructed that our mission was a 10-mile march with full kit. We were told that it was an individual event. Anyone not completing the distance within 2 hours and 45 minutes would be withdrawn from the course. The march began at dusk, and within a very short time we were walking in the darkness of a cool Free State night. I subsequently heard that the timing of this walk was planned so as to begin when it is light and for the candidates to walk into the darkness. Apart from the psychological aspects of such an event, it also prevents the candidates from assessing the area in which the selection takes place. The surface of the road was relatively sound and not that difficult to walk on, but every now and again I would stumble on a boulder or slip on a section that had loose gravel underfoot. I did not have to stop for water, as I had attached a plastic pipe to one of my water bottles, which meant that I was able to drink on the move. Psychologically, this did me the world of good in that I was able to continue with the march while others had to stop and remove their backpacks in order to drink water. The few minutes that I gained were of great value to me when I arrived at the destination. It afforded me the opportunity to sit and rest while the remainder of the group arrived in drips and drabs. The final 2 miles of the walk were, however, very testing. We had left the road, which meant that we had to now negotiate a very unforgiving path in pitch darkness. At last I saw a light in the distance. Within half an hour I was resting under the respected landmark in the area, which was a giant indigenous tree. For the remainder of the course, this tree would become significant in a number of ways. The cut-off came and went, with those candidates who did not finish within the allocated time being withdrawn from the course. We were then instructed to move to an area that had been prepared for the night that lay ahead. Lights hung from electric cable that had been suspended above the ground, and a diesel electric generator screamed in the near distance. There were no shades, which meant that the exposed light hurt the eyes when viewed against the absolute darkness of the area in which we were being tested. The swirling wind gave the impression that the light was dancing in the darkness, and shadows moved irregularly as the bulbs were buffeted above us. We were then informed that the enemy was marching towards us and that we had to dig our defense trenches in order to protect ourselves during the battle that was imminently upon us. It was estimated that this so-called enemy would arrive at daybreak. Our instruction was that we were to dig our trenches throughout the night. The trenches were to be 2 meters long, 1.5 meters wide, and 2 meters deep. The equipment that we carried to the training area included either a pick or a spade. We were ordered to arrange ourselves in such a fashion that the person digging alongside you had a different implement to the one that you had been issued. This was done to ensure that each person had access to both a pick and a spade. We had arranged our kit neatly to one side and were now clad in battle jackets with helmets and rifles. The instruction was that our rifles were to remain across our shoulders. We were not permitted to sit or kneel while digging, and neither were we allowed to speak or communicate in any way. Each candidate was permitted to have only 2 liters of water for the night. The digging began under the close scrutiny of the instructors who patrolled the area in shifts. These instructors constantly told us that we were not going to be successful. They dismissively suggested that we should just hand our shoulder bands in and go and sleep. The Free State ground is solid, and the area in which we were digging was very rocky. Every time I plunged the pick into the ground, sparks would fly from the bedrock that I was attempting to remove. The instructors were having a barbecue in their bush camp. The aroma of their late night meal tantalized my nostrils, which made me realize how hungry I was. On one occasion, an instructor came to me with a plate of grilled sausages, fire-baked potatoes with hot tomato gravy. He asked me if I would like to trade my shoulder band for the food that was on display. Realizing that the selection is more of a psychological assessment than a physical one, I smiled politely and declined the offer. Every half hour or so we were called from our trenches and instructed to stand in a squad. We either sang songs or were ordered to lie on the ground and to roll, first in one direction and then in the other. It did not matter to the instructors that the ground was littered with thorns and rocks. Of course they knew of the piercing barbs and jagged granite pieces, but did what they did so as to make our experience as uncomfortable as possible. We were constantly reminded that we were volunteers and were free to withdraw from the process at any time. At 0100 hours, we were given ration packs and permission was granted to eat. I found it interesting that the tea, coffee and matches had been removed from the ration packs. I certainly could have done with a dash of caffeine in a hot beverage at this stage of the proceedings, but it was not to be. Within 10 minutes, we were instructed to continue digging. As the early morning hours arrived, I felt myself growing very tired. At about 0230, an icy wind descended upon us, and I began to shiver. I was grateful that I had brought my balaclava. Pulling it over my head and then chipping away brought back memories of Charles Bronson taking the part of Lieutenant Danny, the tunnel King Valensky, in The Great Escape. The solid ground made it virtually impossible for the trenches to be dug to the given specifications, but as it turned out, the instructors were more concerned with keeping us busy. They did warn us, though, that a penalty awaited those whose trenches were not dug to their satisfaction. I just kept chipping away at the rock and made myself as inconspicuous as possible. I unconditionally accepted the situation as it was and simply reassured myself that the difficulties would eventually come to an end. Mags was doing well in the trench alongside me, but at about 0300 hours he had a minor setback. For no apparent reason, he looked at me with a glazed expression on his face while shaking his head from side to side. When I called his name, thus risking 50 press-ups for speaking, he seemed to snap out of it and, without further ado, went back to the task in hand. The howling wind played havoc with the sand that surrounded our trenches. The fine dust that coated the rocks found its way into my eyes, which made things very unpleasant. The sound of the generator was very irritating as it churned away endlessly, emitting diesel fumes that burnt the back of my throat. If the instructors were trying to make things uncomfortable for us, they certainly were succeeding. I wanted to sit and rest in the trench, but knew that this would be a very risky thing to do. Instructors appeared out of the darkness with no warning. On several occasions, those individuals who were deemed to be less than focused were called from their trenches and given a serious session of PT in order to discipline them. I must mention that there was a very loudmouth candidate on this course with us. He was an instructor in his own unit, carried the rank of sergeant, and continually tried to crack jokes with the instructors. Even though he dug his trench with enthusiasm, I nevertheless got the feeling that he was heading for a fall. He always spoke with a loud voice, and both surreptitiously and overtly tried to undermine the authority of the instructors. If he had been in the trench alongside me, I would certainly have had a quiet word with him. As it turned out, his familiarity would ultimately lead to his downfall, and I shall make mention of him again. During the night, more than several candidates withdrew themselves from the course, citing injuries and dehydration as reasons for not being able to continue. I certainly pass no judgment on these candidates. Digging those trenches, let me say, was a very difficult and uncomfortable process. The instructors, however, made a display of each failure, and we were all obliged to gather in a squad and watch as the numbered bands were unceremoniously ripped from their shoulders. The drawback of being summoned from the trenches in order to watch this process was that the instructors then ordered us to perform press-ups and jackknives until the retired candidates had collected their kit and disappeared into the darkness. We were then sent back to our trenches, having expended even more of our valuable energy. It was at 0530 that we were summoned for the final time and told that we were allowed to rest in the trenches that we were digging. We were warned to be clean-shaven and ready for foot and rifle inspection at 0700 hours. I wasted little time in getting into my sleeping bag, and the sand that stung my face had little effect as I slipped into a deep sleep within seconds of closing my eyes. Chapter 4. Day 2. Exploring Boundaries. I awoke startled, distinctly disorientated, and literally wondering where I was. The walls of this trench in which I found myself reached up towards a new dawn. I became aware of the sand that had infiltrated my mouth, and a rifle lay heavy upon my torso. It was only when I saw Mags's face smiling down upon me that I remembered where I was. I hauled myself from the trench and immediately assessed the contents of my ration pack. Notwithstanding the confusion that it had caused, the hour that I had slept had restored me to some extent. So too did the food that I ate. I then set about shaving before ensuring that my rifle was clean. However, in scrutinizing my rifle, I knew that I was in for trouble. It was caked with fine dust, and the barrel looked as though it had been buried in sand for years. I did my best to bring it up to an acceptable standard, but knew from previous military experience that I would be obliged to answer a few difficult questions. The medics arrived at precisely 0700 hours, and everyone was instructed to remove their boots and to present their feet for inspection. We had heard the horror stories of how the medics injected all blisters with an alcohol-based antiseptic liquid known as methylate. Luckily, my feet were in perfect condition, and when I witnessed this dreadful event, I gave a prayer of thanks that my boots fitted as well as they did. Watching tears of pain rolling down the cheeks of soldiers who had to endure this torture made me realize the kind of agony that one will endure in order to fulfill a dream. After all, South African paratrooper wings are earned and not simply issued. Captain Marius du Plessis, the course leader, greeted us in his usual enthusiastic way, asking us if we, like him, had enjoyed a good night's rest. The strange thing about it is that we responded with one voice, acknowledging that we had indeed had a good night's rest. We remained in the squad and waited for face and rifle inspection. What a disaster that turned out to be. Contrary to the opinion of the instructor who inspected me, I felt that my face was clean-shaven. He nearly had a heart attack when he viewed the barrel of my rifle against the rising sun. After unleashing a barrage of verbal abuse upon me, he said that I would pay a huge price for allowing my weapon to get so dirty. But I was not alone. Each and every one of us failed the inspection, and we were warned that we would pay dearly for our negligence and poor attitude, not only to personal hygiene, but to the care of our weapons also. Captain Duplessis informed us that, and I quote, there had been a number of casualties during the course of the battle and that we had to evacuate the injured to a safe place. End of quote. However, the evacuation could only begin after we had been warmed up. The first thing that we had to do was fill our trenches. This we did with a sense of disappointment, for it seemed such a shame to have labored the entire night only to fill them again. The psychological implications of this task are of importance to the instructors as they evaluated us to determine whether we carried out the instruction with enthusiasm or not. Working very hard and without communicating with the other members of the course, this task took about an hour to complete. We had to repair the entire area and make the ground as level as possible. Horticulture was not our strongest attribute, so the instructors told us, and they let us know in no uncertain terms that we were not achieving the desired outcomes. Suddenly the pace of the course increased dramatically. With a sense of urgency and aggression, the instructors took us away from the now filled trenches and gave us what I can only describe as the most intense PT session that I have ever endured. From push-ups to sit-ups, from lying down to standing upright, we were aggressively put through our paces. In pairs we did fireman's carry, over and over again, and there were times when I thought that my heart was going to burst out of my chest. When chased around the large indigenous tree that I have previously mentioned, we were expected to cover the 100 meters in less than 30 seconds. Being clad in full battle dress with rifles and helmets made this task incredibly taxing. Sometimes we were ordered to do the run with our rifles held above our heads. While running and on the sound of the whistle, we would fall to the ground and leopard crawl. When next the whistle blew, we had to roll sideways, and the third blast of the whistle meant that we had to stand up and continue running. This continued for quite some time until the instructors felt that we had been sufficiently warmed up. The course leader then informed us that in full battle dress we were to run to a point that would be revealed to us. He then enthusiastically told us that a surprise waited for us when we arrived there. Mags and I set off together and ran at a steady pace towards the destination. We followed a rocky path that took us up onto a plateau. We completed this 3-kilometer run in second and third place respectively, and were not at all surprised to see the most feared of all the selection course equipment. It was the 165-pound stretcher that is constructed of concrete and metal. The initial run to where we now stood was given to split the main group. Each subgroup then consists of 7 members with a maximum of 4 carrying the stretcher at any one time. The others rotate and move in to take over from another member when that candidate got tired and called to be relieved. This event is a test of durability and teamwork. Having finished where we did in the initial run is a huge advantage in that the other 6 members of the team are not only above average runners, but also uninjured.
The teams at the back struggle with candidates whose feet are blistered and who are suffering from various ailments. This in turn leads to arguments and the eventual collapse of the team. The handles of the stretcher are small and, being made of metal, do not make for comfortable carrying. Uncompromising metal and soft flesh simply do not mix. I must say that Mags was exceptional on this exercise. Physically, he is very strong, and he also displays the mental attributes of a winner. Having been involved in surf lifesaving for many years meant that his competitive nature was finely tuned. He rose to the occasion on this day, and in displaying leadership qualities, he encouraged us for the duration of the task. I had to draw on all of my experience while concentrating very hard to ensure that I survived the test. As a former amateur boxing champion, I know what it is like to overcome the odds and to win. I know where to go within myself when the chips are down in order to achieve victory. The stretcher race was nothing short of a journey into hell, and it was during those particular 2 hours that I learnt a little more about myself. Notwithstanding my many years of racing marathons, those 12 kilometers seemed never-ending, and they tested me beyond what I consider to be normal human endurance. Reflecting upon what the body can do, I acknowledge that we are indeed fearfully and wonderfully made. One of the prerequisites of an airborne soldier is discipline within the face of adversity. The stretcher race most certainly creates such adverse conditions, and the instructors are on hand to monitor the dynamics of each team. Those members who do not fulfill the physical and mental criteria are withdrawn from the selection process. Others retire on their own free will, and the mere mention of the stretcher race will forever strike fear and respect into the hearts of those who have been courageous enough to endure its torture. Our team was particularly strong, and the cooperation amongst our members was phenomenal. The instructor who was monitoring our progress gave some encouragement, but he never told us how far we had come or where we were going to. That said, on one occasion he did point to a tree in the distance, saying that this was the destination. When we arrived there, he apologized and said that he had made a mistake. As it turned out, we still had another mile to go. During the very short time that one is not actually carrying the stretcher, one is assisting the team by ensuring that water is always available to them. When one water supply ran dry, another member would present their bottle until it too was empty, and this rotating routine continued until the event had been completed. Walking is prohibited, and if a team begins to fall apart, the instructors order that group to run in the opposite direction for several hundred meters. One can only imagine the negative implications of such an order. As a team, we stumbled over some rocks and did walk for a few meters while we attempted to compose ourselves. The instructor immediately ordered us in the opposite direction, and we made sure that such a mistake did not happen again. Our team completed the race in first position, several minutes within the allocated time. The second team also made it within the allowed time, but those that followed were well outside the actual time allocated. Finishing first meant that we had some time to sit and rest. The loud-mouthed sergeant who finished in the second group was still making a nuisance of himself. He was boasting how easy the course was and how fit he was feeling. I could not understand what he was trying to achieve. Perhaps he was attempting to psych the instructors out. He himself was an army instructor from an infantry unit, and this might well have been his personal modus operandi. Chapter 5. Day 2. A hair's breadth. Captain Duplessis confirmed that only 14 of us had finished the stretcher race within the allocated time. He then said that he would give those candidates who were in the failed teams a chance to redeem themselves. He told them that if they were able to run the 5 kilometers back to the area where the big tree was within 40 minutes, he would allow them to continue with the course. Those of us who had made the cut were transported back to the area in trucks. This gave us the opportunity to rest in the shade of the indigenous tree as we awaited the arrival of the others. While we were waiting, I realized that I was in trouble. I had dehydrated and suddenly I felt very nauseous. I drank water, but my body needed mineral supplements in order for the rehydration process to take place. The ration pack that contained my energy drink sachets was where I had packed them the previous night and as such were unavailable to me at this time. I had made the disastrous mistake of not taking enough provisions with me for the task that had just been completed. All that I could do was to sit quietly and sip water from my water bottle. All too soon we heard the sound of the others singing in the distance as they tried to raise their spirits. At least half of them were not able to complete the run and handed their shoulder bands back to the instructors. Those who withdrew from the course were ordered to take their equipment and to retire to a remote area that had been set aside for them. They were forbidden to watch the proceedings and were instructed to remain out of sight. By this time I was light-headed and shivering. My body craved both minerals and salt. Suddenly doubt began to rise within me, and I questioned whether I was able to continue with the course. The next event began immediately. Each team that had completed the stretcher race together had to box against another team. This was not a one-on-one boxing event, but a group effort which involved a form of football. A helmet was thrown onto the ground, and each team had to prevent the other team from scoring a goal. Needless to say, not much kicking of the helmet took place as we stood toe-to-toe with the opposition and attempted to knock each other out. When someone fell to the ground, the helmet was kicked, and every now and again a goal was scored. The first team to score 3 goals was declared the winner. As a former provincial amateur boxing champion, keeping out of trouble was not a very difficult thing to do. However, the instructors did not appreciate the sweet science of self-defense and were screaming at me to stop boxing and to start fighting. One of the instructors wore a glove on his right hand and pounded my head on several occasions to make up for the blows that I was cleverly evading. I was not happy with this treatment, especially in light of how sick I was feeling. Somehow I managed to see out the entire contest, and as the final goal was scored, I began to vomit. The water that my body was unable to absorb came rushing out, and I heard cries of sarcastic sympathy from the instructors. The instructor who had taken free shots at me during the boxing came running over and attempted to remove the shoulder band that I was wearing. I held my hand over it, and he clipped me on the head before returning to a laughing group of instructors. As I continued being ill, I noticed that the candidates on selection had respectfully turned away from me, and I was grateful to them for this degree of privacy. By now I absolutely knew that I was hanging onto my numbered band by the skin of my teeth, but good fortune was on my side. During the final round of football, a candidate had his lip badly torn by a blow to the mouth. Such was the nature of his wounds that the medics deemed it necessary to take him to the military hospital for attention. Because of this, we were ordered to run back to where our equipment was packed and permission was granted for us to eat. The run further depleted my energy, but once completed, I wasted little time in mixing myself an energy drink, adding 2 sachets of salt for good measure. Within 5 minutes of drinking this potion, I was back to my usual, albeit fatigued self. I had come within a hair's breadth of withdrawing from the course. At this stage, only 48 of the original 179 candidates remained. Mags was doing remarkably well, and we sat together while waiting for the course to continue. Our spirits were high, and it seemed that each time another candidate dropped off the course, the stronger those who remained became. We had heard many stories, and the consensus amongst those who had previously passed selection was that if you were still on the course when the sun went down at the end of the second day, then you had a good chance of completing it. We were very satisfied with the situation as it was, but knew that the bush obstacle course was going to determine the fate of those who now sat waiting for the return of the injured soldier. 20 minutes after we were given time to eat, the instructors blew their whistles and summoned us to the area beside the indigenous tree. Captain Duplessis informed us that the injured candidate would not be returning and that very soon more of us would also be withdrawn from the course. 3 teams were now to compete against each other in towing a 25-ton truck around the indigenous tree. A rope was attached to this truck, and each group had to drag the vehicle around the tree and back to the starting position. The engine was started in order to power the steering and the brakes, but we were the only source of power insofar as the turning of the wheels was concerned. It was a somewhat arduous exercise, and once again the loud-mouthed candidate was being closely monitored by the instructors. Why he persisted in trying to joke with them was, and still is, a mystery to me. Captain Duplessis was watching the proceedings very carefully, and later when I thought about this exercise, I felt that he was assessing each one of us as individuals within a small team. The task, while difficult, was not impossible, but it certainly was dependent upon teamwork and cooperation. The team that I was assigned to had the slowest time, but we were not punished for coming last, so to speak. Suddenly, the already urgent pace of the course was raised once more. Short, sharp instructions were issued, and within a minute we were standing in a squad on the dirt road where we had been towing the truck. We were given 5 minutes to prepare ourselves for the next exercise, and we rushed to ensure that we reported on time to a predetermined area with full battle dress. It was the outdoor obstacle course, a 1-mile event to be completed against the clock 3 times. It is an event that has become the nemesis of so many hopeful airborne soldiers. Captain Duplessis led us around the course and explained what was expected of us. He introduced us to each of the obstacles and, where necessary, got his instructors to demonstrate the required method of addressing each of them. The obstacles in themselves, I noticed, were not exceptionally problematic to negotiate, and yet the overall difficulty of this sudden death event is measured against the number of people who do not make it. It is the congestion that occurs at each obstacle that robs one of the precious time that is required in order to complete the course within the 8 minutes that are afforded for each round. One section took us through a particularly muddy swamp, some of which had to be negotiated in a swimming fashion. Wading through this thick mire means that your boots and overalls are thoroughly soaked, which hinders one's progress on the course. The mental pressure becomes unbearable, and this, coupled with the extreme fatigue that one is already experiencing, is not an easy burden to bear. Throughout each lap, I was acutely aware as to the increase of my heart rate as my body was flooded with adrenaline. So many things can go wrong, from landing awkwardly on one's knee to being accidentally tripped by a candidate who is not paying attention. In an instant, one's selection process can end. While standing quietly and waiting to attempt it for the second and third time, I watched as a number of exhausted candidates simply faded into oblivion on the final stretch to the finish. The instructors, of course, were on hand to remove their shoulder bands and to banish them to that dreaded area where so many now gathered. As the sun began to set in the western sky, just 30 of us were sitting on the dirt road that we were to later walk on once darkness had set in. For the first time since the selection process had begun, Captain Duplessis had some words of encouragement for us. He acknowledged that it was going to be difficult to get more of us off the course because it seemed that we were the only ones who were serious enough to survive. He quickly added, though, that at least another 5 would be gone before his course ended. He allowed us to sit in silence for quite some time, and it was at this time that I offered a prayer of thanks that I was now watching the sun going down at the end of the second day.
Chapter 6. Into the Night. The time that separates dusk from night passed very quickly. Consequently, it was under the canopy of darkness that we were issued with our second ration pack and instructed to prepare our kit for the next exercise. We were told that we were going to leave the area and walk to an undisclosed destination. The loaded march was going to take place in absolute darkness. Furthermore, operational standards were to be observed, which meant that the march was to take place in silence. When I put my backpack on and held my rifle close to my chest, I knew that I was in for a very long night. The backpack seemed as though it were 10 times heavier than it had been the previous night, and to make matters worse, the plastic buckle of my waist strap broke as I was tightening it. This meant that its entire weight would be upon my already exhausted shoulders. The walk began at exactly 1900 hours, and once we had negotiated the initial sharp uphill, it was mainly flat and firm underfoot. The group was absolutely silent, and once again a bitterly cold wind began to blow. It seemed to swirl and change direction, all the time gusting without warning and never subsiding. Flashing strobe lights that had been strategically placed were our route indicators, and after an arduous 3 hours, we came upon a truck and a number of instructors. The truck had as its cargo 4 telephone poles, 8 marbles, and 10 canisters. We were told that these pieces of equipment were to be taken back to where we had started our walk. The specific number of poles, canisters, and marbles was significant in that they divided perfectly into the 30 of us, which meant that everybody would always be actively involved in carrying. A marble is a solid chunk of concrete that is cube-shaped and weighs 25 kilograms. Being an uncompromising chunk of heavy concrete means that carrying it for even short periods of time is very difficult. Moving it around is best done by cradling it as close to one's chest as possible. Telephone poles are both awkward and heavy and require 3 candidates to carry them. The poles had been freshly coated with creosote and were, in fact, still wet. One usually supports these poles on one's shoulder, which meant that within no time at all, our hands, faces, and our necks would be awash with creosote. A canister is made of steel and is used to house ammunition. It is basically a big hollow tube about 1.5 meters long and weighs in the region of 12 kilograms. It is the least difficult of all the implements to carry. However, it becomes a bit of a nuisance in that it occupies an able-bodied person who could be better utilized in carrying one of the heavier, more difficult pieces of equipment. All of a sudden there was dissension within the group. Nobody was able to establish leadership, and many would be less than enthusiastic to carry the poles or the marbles. The logical solution would have been to establish 3 groups and to do the carrying in an organized fashion, but such spirit did not exist within the group. A number of candidates were instructed to board the vehicle and to throw the cargo onto the ground. At this time we had a bit of a scare when a massive snake came slithering through our area. The lights of the military vehicles illuminated this fast-moving reptile as it lifted its hooded head to ascertain the danger into which its nocturnal hunt had brought it. I looked at that enormous reptile with a lot of respect and thought that the sooner we got out of there, the better. It did not take long for the cargo to be distributed, and before we set off, one further instruction was given. We were told that the flashing strobe lights, which had been the route indicators on the outward march, had to be collected going back. These devices are powered by car batteries, and to make matters worse, we were not allowed to switch the lights off when carrying them. In addition to being very heavy, the flashing lights made seeing in the darkness very difficult, even painful. They had no handles, and once you had cradled this very heavy piece of equipment in your arms, the powerful light is less than 6 inches from your eyes. There were times when the unrelenting strobe played tricks on my mind, and on more than one occasion I thought that I was hallucinating. Mags and I stuck close together and did our fair share of carrying. Being as dark as it was meant that no one ever knew if the load was being equally distributed, but we made sure that we assisted within the team. I must say that our loud-mouthed peer did more than his share of carrying. On several occasions I noticed that he had a marble cradled in his arms and one end of a telephone pole balancing on his shoulder. Indeed, I felt that during the course he actually went out of his way to assist those around him. What a pity it was that he tried to be familiar with the instructors and to act as though the selection program was nothing more than another day in his office. There comes a time when fatigue passes and the body just responds to the will of the mind. I knew that I was now operating in a place that I had never been before. My thoughts centered on my ambitions and goals, and I found that by immersing myself in the process, I was better able to deal with the hardships. It was the great Roman philosopher Marcus Aurelius who said that any impediment to action advances action. He taught that what stands in the way becomes the way. I kept encouraging myself with unspoken thoughts such as these and segmented the march from one route indicator to the next. Because my backpack's waist strap had broken, the full weight of the load was directly upon my shoulders, and when I awkwardly moved a telephone pole from one shoulder to the other, my right shoulder popped out of its socket. It was the repeat of an injury that I had suffered many years before, and by the grace of God I managed to pop it back without causing myself too much trauma. From that moment, however, I knew that I would have real difficulty when called upon to use the shoulder again during the course. As it was, I had to favor it while participating in this march. I tried my best to put the incident out of my mind and to focus on the task that was now consuming the very dregs of my energy. Looking back, I stand in awe of what the body can do when called upon to go the extra mile. It was in the darkness of that hour I remembered a statement that Henry Ford had once made when he said that if you think you can or if you think that you cannot, you are probably right. I felt that I could complete the march, and the encouraging words of my sergeant major, who had said that he would support me every step of the way, flashed into memory and gave me a lift. Following a further 5 hours from when we had collected this equipment and encountered the snake, I recognized the large indigenous tree that had now become a place of safety. I remember looking at my watch and saw that it was 0300 hours. The route march had taken us 8 hours to complete. As the selection process approached the 48-hour mark, my body could not help but remind me that up to this point we had only been afforded 1 hour of sleep. When the cargo that we had been carried had been packed neatly away, we were given 10 minutes to eat. The instructors then returned and we were ordered to stand in a straight line facing them. Inspection, they said, would take place at 0700 hours. They then told us to remove our sleeping bags from our backpacks and, while maintaining this straight line, to lie down and get into them. The generator that provided the lighting was then shut down, and before the final backfire of the powerful diesel engine could be heard, I was well into the land of Nod. Chapter 7. Day 3. Chasing Trucks. The piercing blast of an instructor's whistle woke me, and within seconds everyone had pulled themselves from their sleeping bags. There were whispers of excitement, for we knew that we were now into the final 24 hours of the selection program. The routine for the morning was to be the same as it had been the previous day. Everyone to be clean shaven and ready for rifle and foot inspection by 0700 hours. While I certainly did clean my rifle, I did not afford it the attention that I had the previous day. No matter how clean it was, an instructor would still find fault with it. I therefore allocated more time to eat breakfast while concentrating my thoughts on the challenges that lay ahead. The medics arrived and checked our feet. I found it interesting that none of us needed to endure the torture that had been meted out the previous day. Our feet were fine, and it showed how important conditioning is when embarking upon such a challenge. Once the medics had completed their task, we stood in a squad awaiting the arrival of the course leader. This he did with his entourage of enthusiastic instructors who fell upon us and gave us our inspection. Once again, not one of us was up to standard, and immediately a serious PT session began. There were sets of push-ups, sit-ups, jackknives, and the ever-faithful fireman's carry, all done in full battle dress, which always included a rifle. I found these exercises very taxing and pushed myself as hard as I could, possibly even to the outer limit of my endurance. Doing them correctly was essential. Any deviations were quickly dealt with by the instructors, who were hovering around, making the lives of several candidates difficult. While I was still very tired, I felt somewhat restored from the short sleep that we had been afforded. I had eaten carefully from my ration pack, ensuring that I had included both protein and carbohydrates for breakfast. I had also consumed an energy drink, to which I had added a sachet of table salt. That which I had eaten was sustaining me now. My body seemed to be holding out, and while I was nowhere near the front of the pack when returning from a trip around the big tree, I felt as though I could carry on if the pace of the course was not increased dramatically. For me, it was a case of head down and stay out of trouble. I had hoped that my example would have been good enough for our somewhat silly peer, who was persistent with his sarcastic retorts and wise guy sayings. This particular PT session lasted for an hour. When it was called to an end, I was grateful to still be standing. That said, phase 2 of the session was about to start. We were ordered to each collect a marble from a nearby truck before returning to our positions. For this next exercise, we removed our battle jackets and rifles before placing them on the ground, where our other equipment was stored. For the next 45 minutes, we did marble PT. Inasmuch as every set was challenging, the most difficult exercise for me was holding the marble in the air before lowering it behind my head. My shoulder was in agony, and I had very little strength in controlling this chunk of concrete. My arms and legs quivered with each routine. Sometimes I had no option but to rest the marble on my helmet, but this always brought an immediate and aggressive response from the instructors who were observing the proceedings. The one who had punched me during the boxing phase screamed at me, asking if I wanted to part with my shoulder band. Needless to say, I pushed the marble into the air while gritting my teeth as my arms shook uncontrollably. When Captain Duplessis decided that we had had enough, we were instructed to return the marbles to the truck. We were then given 60 seconds to gather our equipment and to climb onto either of the 2 trucks that were parked nearby. There was absolute pandemonium as we rushed about, grabbing our backpacks, battle jackets and rifles before heading for the vehicles. I scrambled up and onto the nearest truck before sitting on the floor quietly celebrating that I had made it within the allocated time. My heart sank when I heard the instructors ordering us to bring our equipment and to climb off again. Lying on the ground in front of us was a rifle. Even though each of us had our own weapon with us, we were nevertheless accused of being negligent in leaving this firearm behind. To this day, I remain convinced that the instructors deliberately placed the rifle in that position. As we stood contemplating our fate, the trucks drove away, and we were ordered to run after them. It was the loud-mouthed sergeant who collected the spare rifle, and in addition to his own weapon and full kit, he carried this rifle also. Unfortunately for me, I had my rifle and battle jacket over one shoulder with my 30-kilogram pack over the other. With every step that I took, I could feel my shoulders straining in the already damaged socket. Improvising as much as I could, I did my best to run in a bent-over fashion in order to distribute the weight upon my back. Running stone last, I kept my head down and simply followed the pair of boots that were in front of me. Soon several candidates began to fall behind even me, and I could hear the instructors demanding their shoulder bands. I felt compassion when I went past one of our number who had collapsed in pursuit of the truck. An instructor had already removed his shoulder band while the medics were preparing to place him on a drip. He had obviously run out of steam and now paid an enormous price for his condition. After 30 minutes of uncomfortable running, I could hear the trucks idling in the distance. When we arrived in the area in which they were parked, we formed up waiting for our next instruction. It was while waiting that I realized that I was now nearing the end of my endurance. We were only 3 hours into the final day, and already I was taking enormous strain. As I pulled my weary body into the back of the truck, I was grateful to the person who took the kit from my back and handed it up to another candidate who was already on this vehicle. During the time that we had been together, my age and civilian status had become quite an issue, not only with the instructors but also with those who were doing the course. The younger soldiers had respect for me, and I felt that they were encouraging me to complete the course. Little gestures like the one that I had just experienced went a long way in helping my cause. We were transported in these trucks before being dropped 1 mile from the parachute regiment. Captain Duplessis was on hand to tell us to gather on the road in full battle dress. He then informed us that we were going to run as a squad back to the regiment. However, he wanted every person in the area to know that his selection course was passing through. In other words, we had to sing on the move. Several of the candidates were able to lead us in song, and Mags and I certainly enjoyed the wonderful spirit that was created through the singing. Being in full battle dress and holding our rifles meant that we were not able to clap, but on every sixth step we stamped our heels into the ground in order to maintain the rhythm. It truly was an uplifting, even edifying moment. As we turned into the main gate of the regiment, the administrative staff rushed out of their offices to welcome us back. By this time, Captain Duplessis had assumed his position in the front of the squad, and he too was jogging in time to the singing. On entering the unit, we veered to the right before heading for the parade ground. While circumventing this enormous piece of land, the spectators whistled and shouted encouragement at us. It was an amazing feeling, but I did not get carried away by the generosity of the moment. It was early days yet. Much physical and psychological testing still lay ahead. Duplessis then made his way up to the parachute training centre, and we, like the rats and the mice in the Pied Piper of Hamelin, obediently followed in his footsteps. We knew where our jogging was taking us, and were finally brought to a standstill alongside the regiment's obstacle course. As the singing subsided, the harsh reality of our situation returned. We knew full well the reputation of this obstacle course and the challenges that the next test would bring. Chapter 8. A Cry of Anguish. The obstacle course in the parachute regiment is a very challenging, even dangerous event, and it is notorious for its difficulty. Scaling walls, swinging on ropes, and negotiating very high climbs have to be executed with precision and discipline. It is also a test of speed, strength, and balance. Some teamwork is involved as well. The instructors separated us into 3 groups. We were told that the course had to be completed 3 times, while the time limit for each round was set at 18 minutes. A large crowd, which now also included those who had been withdrawn from the selection, had gathered to watch the proceedings, but despite the mass of faces, I felt an inexplicable sense of extreme loneliness. In retrospect, I understand that these feelings were as a result of my fatigue and depleted neurotransmitters. This is a condition that accompanies physical exertion and sleep deprivation. Standing tall, I took several deep breaths of air before entering the arena with all the courage and determination that I could muster. Mags literally sailed away from all of us during this event. Throughout the course, he displayed the characteristics of the outstanding athlete that he is. I was undoubtedly the weakest of everyone. I focused my mind and concentrated on each and every task that I did. I felt that by going at a steady pace, albeit slow, I would manage to complete the 3 cycles. My main objective was to avoid further injury. While climbing to the highest part of what is known as the elephant, I saw a candidate falling from the beams directly below me. He lay unmoving while the medics rushed to his assistance. I later heard that he had broken his arm, and this left just 28 of us on the course. On my second round, I experienced a setback when I lost balance while swinging on a rope across a deep pit towards a commando net. As I swirled out of control, I made a desperate attempt to reach the commando net towards which I was traveling. By some stroke of luck, my right arm hooked itself into this net, but in doing so, the intercostal muscles at the top of my ribs were damaged. The net had saved me, of that there is no doubt, but I had sustained yet another injury to the right side, the dominant side of my body. The other candidates whose progress was at the same pace as mine were taking as much strain as I was. We quietly encouraged each other through each obstacle. The instructors remained relentless with their verbal tirades, and we had to show aggression at all times. When an instructor approached me, I put a determined look on my face. Doing so seemed to satisfy them insofar as being aggressive was concerned. It was while waiting to be summoned to the start of the obstacle course for the third time that I witnessed something I shall never forget. The loud-mouthed candidate was part of the group that went before the group to which I had been assigned. At one particular obstacle a rope ladder hangs about 1.5 meters above the ground. It is almost impossible to get onto this ladder without having someone to steady it for you. The last man in the group would assist his buddy, and then the instructors would hold the ladder so that this last man could proceed. Our loud-mouthed participant was called by the course leader when he arrived at this particular obstacle. The course leader was having a few words with him while his team passed through this section of the course. Being dismissed, the loud-mouthed chap then looked around to see that he was standing at the bottom of the rope ladder with not another soul in sight. The course leader then instructed him to continue. He approached the ladder and made an attempt to proceed. The ladder swung in an uncontrolled manner and he fell to the ground. When this happened, Captain Duplessis loudly warned him that he had 2 more attempts to continue with the event. He stood up and addressed the ladder. In pulling himself to the first rung, he also made an attempt to steady it so that he could continue climbing. By now I knew what was transpiring and watched in horror as the ladder swung out of control before dumping him onto the seat of his overalls. He made his final attempt, but once again the center of gravity of the pendulum that he became made it impossible for him to proceed, and he fell sideways onto the dusty ground. Before he could even look up, Captain Duplessis had ripped his shoulder band from his overall and whispered something to him. As he withdrew himself from the arena and walked past my position, I turned my eyes to the ground. I should also have put my fingers into my ears, because his loud sobbing was not something that brought me any joy. There were now only 27 of us on the course. During the third and final round of the obstacle course, we were instructed to attempt the monkey bars. For reasons not clear to me, this section of the course had not been included for the first 2 rounds. I made my weary way to the start of the bars, and when I leapt upward, I was at least able to hang between heaven and earth. When the instructor told me to get a move on, I released my right hand and reached for the next bar. I had sufficient power in my left arm to support myself, but when I tried to lock my right hand, nothing happened. I fell backwards onto my head and was immediately thankful for the battle helmet that I was wearing. The instructor shouted at me to do it again, and after I had scooped a handful of sand in order to dry my hands, I repeated process. This time I made an attempt to reach for the next bar with my left hand, but my right shoulder would not carry my weight. Down I went again onto the hard earth. The instructor made no attempt to remove my shoulder band, but threateningly said that he would be watching me closely for the remainder of the course. With that he waved me through, and no further attempt at the monkey bars was expected. To this day I do not know what that little deviation was all about. It was only Mags and 2 other candidates who were able to complete each round within the allocated time. The rest of us were several minutes outside of the time allowed. Strangely, we were not reprimanded for this, and so I assume that the stopwatch had been employed in order to pressurize us into making mistakes. It was only when the 3 rounds had been safely negotiated that I began to feel a quiet confidence within myself. I had now safely navigated the most dangerous part of the course, and even though the right side of my body was in a broken state, I felt that I had what it would take to be successful. The 27 of us were then ordered onto a military truck and driven a short way into the country. When we came to a stop, we were each issued with a canister and told that the next exercise was an individual event against time. Clad in full battle dress, we had to carry our canisters a distance of 6 kilometers. Anyone failing to complete this test within 40 minutes would be withdrawn from the course. I have already described how awkward it is to carry a canister. Most people sling their rifles over one shoulder and balance the canister over the other. I felt more comfortable in holding it across my chest. Running is the strongest of all my disciplines, but despite this, I was not able to run the entire distance. I resorted to walking for short periods of time, which allowed me the opportunity to rest and to bring my heart rate back to an acceptable level. Mags was once again particularly strong and finished in 3rd position. Without doubt, he was getting stronger and stronger as the course unfolded. He never failed, though, to give me an encouraging word, and I certainly drew strength from his support. It was the canister race that I was determined to dominate, and later in the story you will appreciate why. Each and every one of us completed it successfully before being reminded by Captain Duplessis that a penalty had to be paid by those candidates whose trenches had not been dug to his satisfaction. He called out the names of the candidates, most of whom had long ago been withdrawn from the course. Except for 2 lucky chaps, the rest of us gathered together in a squad on the dirt track. The 2 fortunate candidates whose trenches had been dug to the required specification got onto a vehicle and immediately set off. We were then instructed to run after it. After some 20 minutes of steady running and singing together in the squad, the truck came to a standstill. Captain Duplessis, who was riding alongside us on his off-road motorcycle, called us to a halt before telling us that we had 30 seconds to get onto the truck. The 50-meter dash was hectic, and when I looked again, it was only me and 2 others who had not been successful. The truck then sped off with the 3 of us in pursuit before it came to a standstill further down the track. The same procedure was implemented, and it was only with the generous help of hands that reached out to grab our overalls and pull us up onto the vehicle that we all managed to make it to safety. Chapter 9. Dusk on Day 3. Tribulation and Redemption. There was a wonderful atmosphere in the back of the truck as we sang songs and clapped rhythmically. When we stopped, we saw that we were back in the area where the large indigenous tree was. It was late in the afternoon, and within an hour the sun would be clipping the horizon. Sensing that the selection was drawing to a close, there was a quiet jubilation amongst the others. I, however, was not fully convinced. I somehow had a feeling that we were on the verge of something dramatic. The colonel who commanded the parachute regiment was waiting to receive us. He had requested that he watch each of us box. He had thus made the trip from his office to witness what the military refer to as milling. Gloved and using head guards, 2 candidates stand toe to toe and attempt to land heavy blows on their opponents. Each round lasted for 60 seconds and had to be repeated twice. I had little problem with this event and simply kept my right hand up against my cheek while delivering left jabs and hooks onto the face and body of my opponent. Being orthodox in stance meant that it did not matter that the right-hand side of my body was, in essence, ineffective. I used head movement to evade punches and, when necessary, swayed out of reach while avoiding the telegraphed blows that were being fired at me. The dynamics of this session were very different from the football session of the previous day, and the instructors seemed to enjoy the boxing display. Don't get me wrong, it was hard work. Boxing in itself is physically demanding, and at this stage of the selection course it was infinitely more so. However, the playing fields were now level, and unlike the boxing session of the previous day, I was not dehydrated. Dusk had arrived by the time each of us had completed our 2 rounds, and an instructor ordered us to sit down. With a beaming smile on his face, he told us that the selection process was over and he congratulated us on being successful. We were then told to return to the truck. The truck was driven for a little way and then it came to an abrupt stop. In a very aggressive manner, we were ordered to gather all of our equipment and to alight from the vehicle. Waiting to receive us was Captain Duplessis. He informed us that his message to the instructor who had told us that the course was over had been misinterpreted, and my heart sank with the sun that had all but disappeared. One last exercise remained. Carrying all of our equipment, we were ordered to collect a sandbag from the back of Duplessis' pickup truck. These sandbags weighed 25 kilograms, and when each of us was in possession of one, we had to stand and wait for the next instruction. The instructors had disappeared into their bush camp, and we could hear them laughing as they sat around a large fire, possibly quenching their thirsts after another long day at the office. If I had words that could effectively describe the emotions that I was now feeling, I would express them. All I can say is that my kit felt like lead, and the sandbag that was tucked into my chest felt heavier than anything that I had ever experienced before. After a short wait, Duplessis made an appearance and told us that we had to march the 16 kilometers back to the headquarters in Bloemfontein. He told us that it was a timed event and that anyone not making it within 3 hours would be withdrawn from the course. Duplessis then asked if anyone would like to offer their shoulder bands for a barbecue and an ice-cold beer. It was a question that had no answer. He stood looking at us for several minutes before disappearing into the bush camp. My sandbag was slipping down my chest, and I did my utmost to secure it by moving my elbows closer together. This seemed to help, and I found that by leaning forward I was able to keep it relatively secure. The instructors then arrived with ice-cold beers and freshly barbecued meat. Again, they tempted us with this food, but it was all to no avail. By the time that we were ordered to depart, it was pitch dark. The instructors drove behind us with the powerful lights of the ambulance fixed firmly on proceedings. Within a few hundred meters, we were instructed to stop. The emergency lights of the ambulance shone brilliant upon us, and I found myself gazing, almost mesmerized, into the darkness. For a moment I felt as though I was participating in some bizarre ritual. Quickly I pulled my thoughts back, and seconds later we were given an about-turn instruction. We then shuffled warily back to the bush camp where the fires had been lit. Our course leader invited us into the bush camp, and we were asked to find a place to sit. Duplessis then quietly explained that his course was over and that we had been successful. He said that the final exercise had only been given to determine the mental attitude of each individual. It had never been his intention for us to march back to the headquarters in Bloemfontein. That is all that he said. There was absolute silence, and nobody moved, looked around, or said a word. The fire was burning intensely, and I could feel its radiating heat from where I was sitting. I became aware of the crickets that were chirping in the darkness, and far away I heard the lone cry of a wild dog. My wife and I were expecting our first child, and on the day before I had travelled to Bloemfontein. I had taken her to hospital to have her scheduled scan. I had seen our perfectly formed baby on a monitor, and the memory of our baby's beautiful profile came flooding into my mind. The moment was very emotional, and I had little control of the tears that rolled off my cheeks and onto the rifle that was on my lap. I was not the only one who had been touched by the occasion, and each of us dealt with the situation in our own private way.
Chapter 10. The Epilogue. I attended the parachute jump course in January of the following year, and during March I graduated from the parachute school with my wings. At the age of 39 years and 7 months, I am amongst the oldest in the history of our Defence Force to have achieved this. Mags was on the same parachute course, but through no fault of his own had his finger severely injured in the aircraft as we were preparing to do our 6th jump. As I narrate this account, I am delighted to say that Mags returned the following January and was successful in his quest to realize the dream that brought him his wings. Also, if you recall, I made mention of a young chap who on day 1 graciously insisted that I carry first when doing the fireman's lift. The year is now 2020, and 21 years have passed since that day. I must record that he is now a senior and high-ranking officer in the parachute regiment of a Commonwealth Army. Inasmuch as I have now earned South African paratrooper wings, the lessons learnt are far more important. I certainly wear my wings with great pride, but in essence they are only metal with very little intrinsic value. If I were to throw them away and never to wear them again, such an act would not detract from the enormous personal growth that occurred during those 3 days and 2 nights. Many years ago, Cassius Clay, as he was known at that time, took his Olympic gold medal and cast it into the Ohio River. He understood that the medal itself was not the champion within. In the same way, the wings as an object are not my character. However, earning my wings developed my character tremendously. We often hear that personal change is not easily achieved, but I can confidently say that my life changed for the better because of the experience. In closing, I would like to share a few thoughts concerning the lessons that I learnt. Never stop looking for a new adventure. Life can become routine, but by embracing a new opportunity, a boost of enthusiasm will be added. Believe that you can achieve your goals. When you set them, never doubt that you can accomplish them. Remain quietly confident and continuously reaffirm your commitment to the process. Believe in yourself, but also always embrace the dynamics of a team. Never alienate yourself from a group unless participation with them is going to lead to your demise. Have good judgment, and if you err, ensure that you err on the side of caution. Remain humble and do not attract attention to yourself. Being loud is folly, and one should therefore speak one's mind with a quiet confidence. Concentrate on the task in hand and do things methodically. Speed is sometimes essential, but if you are able to achieve a desired outcome with less haste, then do so. Segment each challenge that you are facing. A 10,000-mile journey begins with the first step. Be an encourager. Words can either make you or break you. Choose your words carefully and sow them wisely. This equally pertains to the words that you speak to yourself. Surround yourself with excellence and value the support of those who, like Mags, are committed to the same cause. Sometimes you will find yourself in dark places, and the only lantern that you will carry is your own self-belief. My final point on lessons learnt is that one should expect to experience times of loneliness. You will find that it is in these periods of solitude and isolation that deep personal growth occurs. In bringing the selection process to its conclusion, I must acknowledge that for part of the closing scene and part of the closing scene alone, I have made partial and considered use of dramatic license in order to bring the event to its crescendo. That said, the story that you have heard is a true and genuine account of the selection process, and such license does not, in any way or form, detract from its integrity. The best way to describe the use of such license is like adding a frame to an already beautiful picture. The names of Sergeant Major Smith and Captain Marius Duplessis are fictitious. I have chosen these names to protect their true identity. Also, having completed 2 parachute selections, my first attempt ended in disappointment when, even though I completed the final test, that canister race, it was 27 seconds outside of the 40 minutes allowed. I have therefore made use of a mixture of my experiences of both selections. The opening chapter of this account, the prologue, depicts the final moments of that failed attempt. I thank you for listening to this, my story, and of course to Mags, who remains not only an inspiration, but also my brother. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. The end.